everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode here of the K2 podcast. Today is Monday, May 25th. Got something, I guess, pretty cool lined up for you this evening. What we're going to do is talk about a few stories and a few headlines and some things that maybe should have been in the news that didn't pop up in the news during the whole pandemic. Because sometimes when anything that's I guess anything that kind of takes over something like the coronavirus has, just completely takes over the media by storm. And it seems like that's the only thing that we hear of, or whatever seems to be the main topic or the main issue at hand. That's what we tend to hear about the most. So I picked a few stories that I wanted to cover, kind of just talk about a little bit, and some things that you may have missed, and see what you think. So what we'll do is we'll get right into our first show tonight. So our first story, excuse me. So for the first story tonight, SpaceX. If you're not familiar with SpaceX, that is the company owned by CEO Elon Musk, who is also the CEO of Tesla. So basically, this SpaceX company is going to be launching into the outer space there, and they're going to be going to the International Space Station. So this particular launch is scheduled to go on Wednesday, which is the 27th. So this month, May 27th, and I believe they're scheduled to launch at 4:32 p.m. I thought that was kind of cool. They're going to be launching from the Kennedy Space Center from apparently Launch Pad 39A. Now, I really wasn't familiar with what Launch Pad 39A was, but apparently that's the same launch pad that Apollo 11 launched from, which is the mission that sent humans to the moon. So I thought that was very interesting. Also, the really cool part about this particular mission is this is the first time humans will be sent into orbit from within the United States since 2011. So basically, pretty much 10 years that we've sent humans to space from the United States, which I found to be very interesting because, with the way technology is going and with everything that you see happening, it's just kind of interesting that of all things, our space program seems to be the one that's lacking the most, so I found that to be kind of crazy that, we're considered one of the most powerful countries in the world, and our space program has really lacked. So it's good to see that SpaceX is getting out there and going to send some people into orbit, some actual humans, and not just some satellite that, so I just thought that was really cool. Another very interesting part that I found to be really cool is that the Dragon spacecraft, which they're going to be using, is pretty much one of its kind. There's no other spacecraft like it. This particular spacecraft can carry up to 7 people, but I believe for this particular mission, they're only going to be sending 2 astronauts, which I have pictured on the screen there. You can see both of those guys. But not only is this particular spacecraft capable of sending humans, it's also capable of sending equipment to the International Space Station and also bringing equipment back to Earth with it. So that's something that you haven't really seen before with any kind of spacecraft. So it's quite interesting to see that's what they're going to be doing. In addition to that, the 2 astronauts' names are Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm not sure if that's his actual name, but both of these particular astronauts have delivered parts or pieces to the International Space Station in previous past missions, so they have a little bit of experience. So I guess you could say this isn't their first rodeo. Now, also with the spaceship, the Dragon spacecraft, it's capable of staying in orbit for at least 210 days. But this particular mission will launch with the two astronauts on board, depart this. What they're going to go to the International Space Station, depart the space station, and they re-enter Earth's atmosphere. Apparently, they're going to be landing in the ocean, from my understanding, just off the Florida coast, and then the crew will be picked up at sea by SpaceX's team. Now, you can watch this launch. Apparently, they're going to be doing a live coverage, and I believe it's going to be hosted by ABC News and National Geographic, beginning at 3 p.m. They're scheduled to launch at like 4:30, but the coverage begins at 3 p.m. on May 27th. So that's this Wednesday. You can check the link in the description below, and that link will actually tell you. You can actually tune into that link and watch the launch. So I think that'll be something pretty exciting to look forward to, something that we haven't seen in quite a while as a country. Is anybody sending humans to space? So I'm looking really, really cool. And Cosmos in the chat says Discovery Channel has exclusive broadcasts. Yeah, that link is I have a link in the description below, so you'll be able to check that out. So our next story is kind of one that you kind of would see on the the grocery store self-checkout line, or not even the self-checkout, just like when you're going through the grocery store, the little tabloid section, the crazy stories you see, like what do you call it, like you'll see one of those stories that say mermaid has washed up on the beach, or you name it. You've seen all these crazy, I wouldn't even call them conspiracy theories, but just wild tabloid stories that most of the time have no truth to them whatsoever. However, on my news feed, when you think of tabloids, like I said, I always when I thought of tabloids, I always thought of them as something that you, like I said, you see at the grocery store. But now they're showing up in your social media timelines, in your email. It's almost impossible to escape them. And what's really interesting about it is it almost, it muddies the water up. I don't know if that's the right word, but it muds the water up of what's real and what's not, and it kind of just gets everything convoluted when it's just right there in your face. Before, like I say, when you go to the grocery store, you have an option whether to pick up that paper or not. But when you're scrolling through your social media accounts or you're checking your email and it's right there in your face 24/7, it really makes things difficult. But recently there's an article that popped up on my social media that I'd been seeing quite a bit of. It wasn't just like one random story. It was like really pushed out there. But the article was claiming that there was evidence found of a parallel universe. Now, for me, this was something kind of exciting because I've always liked we're talking about the SpaceX story. I've always liked the thought of space, and it's something that we know very little about. Of course, we do have a pretty extensive space program, but we don't quite know as much as you would think that we know about space, so they're always discovering new planets, new moons, stuff like that. So it was quite interesting to see, oh wow, evidence of a parallel universe. I'm excited about this. It got me pumped up, something that I really wanted to look into. So I was really intrigued by this story, but I dug a little deeper because it is something that you have to look into. It's something you have to investigate, like I said, when you get excited by it. But apparently there was a team of scientists. I believe they come from they're out of a college from Hawaii. I forget the exact college that they came from, but apparently the story goes that they sent this antenna in Antarctica across the ice that was attached to a couple weather balloons, and the weather balloons flew across the ice and was detecting what they were looking for was something called high energy particles, which if I'm not mistaken, could just be simplified into something that's called radio waves. So they're searching for these so-called radio waves as they go across the ice. Now, they sent this particular antenna out. I believe the antenna is called Anita. That was like an acronym for the antenna. I forget what the exact acronym is, but they would send this antenna across the ice. Now, they sent it out one time, and they found absolutely nothing. Then a year later, I believe there's a year interval in each time that they sent out the antenna, but the second time that they sent out the antenna, also they found nothing. Well, the third time they sent it out, they heard a few noises on there, but kind of just dismissed it as simply just noises. They didn't think anything of it. Ooh, excuse me. So they didn't think anything of the noises, but they decided to go back and look at the data from the third test or the third experiment when they sent this antenna out. Well, upon further review, they noticed that there were some high energy particles that was coming up from the ice in Antarctica. So when they noticed that the ice, or that these signals were coming up, they're trying to just figure out, well, why are we getting these signals? We can't figure out what this is. Well, one of the scientists who was in charge of the whole experiment basically said, well, this could be a parallel universe. That was just something that he offered as a plausible explanation. He wasn't saying for certain that, yes, this is a parallel universe, but it was something that he offered up as a possible explanation. But there's also a bunch of other explanations that have come out through this whole thing as well. And another interesting portion of this story, because like I said, I was intrigued by it, and I was like, if this is real, they're using the words NASA, that's going to get your attention when it says NASA scientists have discovered a parallel universe. So you're going to perk up a little bit and think, oh wow, NASA's onto something. That's got, so that's what got me involved in it and really wanting to look at it. But according to the guy who was the principal investigator of the whole experiment, said that this stories that he's been seeing is actually some unfortunate tabloid journalism. So this is where he's saying basically this was just some tabloid, like a publicity stunt for clicks and views. And it was quite interesting because I started to research this, and as I researched the story, I traced all the stories back to one source, which was a website called newscientist.com. I have that linked in the description below as well. You can click on that link. But I clicked on that link to kind of find out, because this is where I won't say the original story came from, but when all this information kind of resurfaced, that was the article that everybody was taking the information from. So when I looked at this particular article, I noticed there was a paywall for it. So what that means, like, it was a paywalled website. So what that means is, if you're ever a member of the New York Times, or there's several websites where they'll let you read a paragraph, but in order to read the rest, you have to pay or subscribe to the website in order to view the whole content. So I found that to be already kind of silly. So it's almost like they're basically getting you to pay for this information. And just to get back to the guy who was leading the investigation, said that there's nothing that necessarily makes what we found is a detection of a parallel universe. And like I said, he said they just made some things up about myself and the experiment. So he's saying, look, not only are they misquoting me, they're saying, they're making up stuff about my own experiment that I conducted, that I started to, I put the information together, and they're misquoting me and telling me what, they're just making stuff up. A couple of the other scientists jumped in on the matter. I'll read a couple of quotes that I found on the whole parallel universe situation. But it says, jumping straight to parallel universes is a little over the top, and there are less mind-boggling theories that could explain what Anita, which was the antenna, has detected. There are a number of potential candidate particles that could account for the results from Anita, says Grant Lewis, an astrophysicist at the University of Sydney. So he's basically just saying there's a number of reasons and explanations for why this whole thing occurred. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's some kind of parallel universe out there. So if you are interested in more about this story, I mean, it just kind of got me disappointed. I don't know if you've particularly seen this story pop up in your time feed or in your timeline at all, or on your news feed, I guess it's called. If you see any of that, or you may have seen this particular story pop up, I do have links down in the description where you can investigate it a little bit more and kind of do your own research on it. But moving forward is probably one of the more important stories of the night. So the reason this is pretty important, because when you think about, we're shifting gears here from parallel universes, but the government recently has been under fire because there was a proposal that recently went to the Senate that was ultimately rejected. This proposal is called the Wyden-Daines Amendment, and this is an amendment which was part of the whole Patriot Act, where the government could not spy on you, but basically, well, I don't know, some people would say spy on you, but apparently if there was suspicion of terrorism, or there was any kind of threat to the national security, the United States government would enact the Patriot Act to investigate and kind of dig deeper into one's browsing history and their internet data and their footprint. So the interesting part about this story is it was rejected by one vote, and the government, basically what I'm trying to get at, the government's looking at your web browsing history, and they're able to do this without any kind of warrant or any kind of, I don't want to say due process, but they're basically able to spy on Americans and look at your data, anything that you're searching, everything that you search for. Just think about everything you've put into a Google search. Is that something you would want the government to know? Now, if you're like many people, you may say, well, I don't care, who cares what the government looks for? Who cares? I don't search for anything crazy. So I don't care if the government looks at my search history or not. So it doesn't really bother me at all if they search it. So some people have that thing, but when they begin to maybe make a profit from it, then would you care? Not saying that you would, but when it's your data, you're not getting any of that money. You're not getting any cut. So if they're selling off this information and making a profit at your expense or your data, I mean, that seems kind of wrong to me. But you can almost think of, like, some people would say Google searches and your internet history is like some people would say that's like their deepest and darkest secrets, stuff that they don't particularly want to get out. Maybe you have a medical condition and you're searching, some of the side effects from that medical condition, or maybe you're trying to find ways of, like, you're going through some really depressing times, and that could be something that could be used against you or later down the road. So regardless of what that search history is, some people have compared it to like a confessional at a church, where your search history, you go in and it's private. It's a one-on-one setting with like a confessional, so that's how some people have viewed the data, or have described the whole situation. But it also gives you like a glimpse into someone's love life, who their enemies could be. Even if you could go as far as saying your weekly meal plans, like if you're just trying to like meal prep and stuff like that, the government can know when you eat, what you're buying, when you're buying it. I mean, it's like an invasion of privacy. Now, some people say, hey, that's silly. Who cares? It's simple data. Like, who cares? Like, who cares if they know what I eat? Maybe you don't care. But where do you draw the line? It's just kind of interesting to see that they can just basically know you as a person inside and out, and some things you may or may not want them to know. Um, but you can another thing that I want to bring into question is there's a what people have been saying about this whole thing is that it violates the Fourth Amendment. Now, if you're not familiar with the Fourth Amendment, it just guarantees Americans the right to be secure in their person, their houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizures. And then it lays out the requirements for the government to get a warrant if they have to. So basically, this particular amendment, which is called the Wyden-Daines Amendment, and this is supposed to be an amendment to the Patriot Act, and like I said, it was denied when it went through the Senate. Now, many of the people are saying that this particular amendment is being infringed upon, and of course, with the whole coronavirus thing, there's a lot of what people are saying rights are being, like certain constitutional rights and things like that are being amended on. This kind of could be another one that's kind of slipping under the radar, because a lot of what you see now is people saying that the lockdown or telling me what I can and can't buy or what I can and can't do with my body is unconstitutional. You're just seeing all kinds of different arguments surrounding this whole coronavirus. But this particular one is another one that maybe slid under the radar that you maybe didn't notice. But it's saying that many people are saying that this amendment is being infringed upon, or at least has lost some of its effect. Also, one study that I found showed about 63% of Americans do not think it's possible to go about their daily lives without the government entities collecting data about them. This was according to the Pew Research Center, and also an 84% say they feel very little or no control over the data collected by the government. So that's kind of concerning, because ultimately for me, and just think if you flip the tables real quick, because the government can look at everybody else's data, but we don't get to look at the government's data, and I guess some of it rightly so when it comes to national security and things like that. But if we're talking about the individual person, you don't always get to check, you don't get to see that kind of stuff. And another interesting point from this is some of the most powerful companies in tech, including like Apple, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft, had lined up behind this whole, behind the Wyden-Daines Amendment, which really doesn't seem, which is kind of interesting that they would do that. I'm not really sure where that comes from, because they're probably one of the largest collectors of data there is out there. But another guy spoke for the amendment. His name was Ferris Veen, who's a policy manager at Mozilla. If you're not familiar with Mozilla, it's basically a web browser, kind of like Internet Explorer or Google Chrome, but there's also Mozilla. So this guy, Ferris Veen, said, he says, Americans deserve the strong protections for their online activities provided by the proposed amendment. If it would have made clear that the government needs a warrant for browsing and search history, which may provide an intimate portrait of our health, our finances, and our daily lives. So the Justice Department did not respond to any requests for comments. So no matter, like everybody's reached out. I've tried even sending them an email to no prevail. So they didn't respond to any comments, but they did say during a congressional hearing that the broad law of this whole thing was supposed to be used and be helpful towards terrorism investigations, not to spy on American people. But it doesn't say anything specifically to stop them from doing that. So one leads to believe, like, yeah, okay, the broad picture is to stop terrorism, but you're leaving that opening to do what you will without having any warrant or any probable cause or any of that necessarily. They can just do it at their will or their leisure. Maybe it's somebody they don't like. Maybe you're going to attempt to run for public office one day. Maybe you're who knows what your future may hold. Anything that you have searched could come back to haunt you and could be leaked, or the government could use to their advantage or bring it up and use it against you in the court of law one day. Like I said, the whole idea behind the Patriot Act was supposed to be used in terrorism investigations, and that was the intent. But the government or the prosecutors could access your internet history, but it says that they are able to access your internet history, but they're supposed to pass one hurdle before viewing someone's internet history. So before the Justice Department or the government can demand records from a business such as Google, it must first obtain an order from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and apparently it's a secretive court made up of federal judges from around the country. So they have to they're saying, even though they don't need a warrant, they still have to go through this Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Now, I don't know if that pertains specifically to the terrorism aspects of it, because it has the word Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and it says it's a secretive court. So there's not a whole lot of information on the court itself. But anyway, Wyden and Daines, the guys who are making the amendment, said in separate statements on Thursday that they plan to keep pressing this amendment to Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Wyden also said a large bipartisan majority of 59 senators actually supported this amendment. So he also goes on to say, "I'm confident that if it were to come up again, the important protections of American rights would pass," he said. So the guy goes on to say they do think they're going to introduce it again. They're going to put it back in there, and they think it's going to pass the second time, which I would like to see it. Americans shouldn't be being spied on for whatever the reason. Your data and your search history and all of that stuff should be at the government's leisure to just basically use at their will. So that's it for that story. If you want to read up more on that one, I do have the link in the description on that one as well. Another interesting take. Now, this one has kind of surfaced a little bit up on the news, but it hasn't got the full coverage that I feel that it deserves. It's a little bit of an unsettling story, but apparently millions of pounds of fresh food is being destroyed by farmers as a result of business loss during the closure and the lockdowns. Now, when I first saw this, I'm thinking, well, the grocery stores are practically empty. What do you mean that they're having to dump food? You got the food bank lines are backed up around the building. I don't understand, why can't they? How is it that they're having to destroy all of this food? Well, come to find out, one, it's about, when it comes to the food banks, they just don't have the space for it, as far as like for their cold products, like refrigerators and stuff. It's very expensive to keep cool and frozen items. That takes a lot of money, and a lot of those food banks and things just don't have the space or the refrigerator space for it. And then also, you think about schools being closed down, so a lot of like food and things that would be going to the schools has also affected it. So pretty much the supply chains across the country are somewhat being broken. Now, we are starting to see many states kind of open back up, and things are starting to get progressively better, I'd like to think. I hope. I mean, I don't know, but hopefully all the food and everything that our supply chain and our foods will get kind of restored, and everything will kind of get back to normal, and people won't be having to destroy their products. But from an article, I took a little bit of snippet that said they're having to dump thousands of gallons of fresh milk, which is interesting. An Idaho farmer apparently had to dig huge ditches to bury 1 million pounds of onions. He goes on, and I was thinking, onions, what's the big deal with onions? Well, he goes on and says the amount of waste is staggering. The nation's largest dairy Cooperative Dairy Farmers of America estimates that farmers are dumping as many as 3.7 million gallons of milk each day. A single chicken processor is smashing 750,000 unhatched eggs each week. And then when it comes going back to the onions, the guy said, when you think about restaurants that have closed down, that's a huge industry. That when you think of things like onion rings and stuff, or just burgers with onions or steaks and stuff like that, onions as a whole is not being widely purchased right now, so they're having to get rid of a lot of this stuff. But many farmers are saying that they are donating what they can to surplus food banks and Meals on Wheels programs, which have been overwhelmed with demand, like I was saying. But there's only so much food that the charities with limited numbers of refrigerators and volunteers can absorb. So it's kind of a wide scale issue, but from what I've gathered, it looks like dairy farmers are actually taking the biggest hit. The dairy industry, where cows, because with cows they have to be milked multiple times a day, regardless of whether there are buyers for this milk or not. You have to milk those cows. Now, typically you would have a buyer for this milk, and it's just cranking out. But now they're having to milk these cows just as part of the dairy process, just to help the cows out. They have to get them milked. So a lot of that's just going to waste. And also, dairy farmers are grappling with low prices and sudden drop in demand from the lockdown. And like I said, they're dumping as many as 3.7 million gallons of milk every day. And this goes back to the public schools, where a lot of these kids are drinking the milk at schools and things like that. Now, on a positive note, our president gets a lot of flack, but he did recently announce a $19 billion relief program called the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. This is a program that's going to provide $16 billion in payments to farmers and ranchers, and $3 billion in purchases of fresh produce, dairy products, and meat to be distributed at food banks. The program follows a different aid package than the one of the Department of Agriculture implemented for farmers hit by trade war tariffs. So kind of an interesting story, something that I didn't think was getting a lot of attention. I've also linked this story in the description below, and you can do more research on it for yourself. But the next thing we got up is another surprising one, is endangered animals are actually facing bigger threats right now. Because of the lockdowns, they've led to there's been a huge decline in wildlife conservation funding and higher rates of poaching. You have these animals like these white rhinos who are actually on the verge of extinction, but they're actually on the rise. But there's a chance that all the progress made could actually be lost, because in Africa, typically right now, especially in the summer months and things, the tourism would be booming. But since the coronavirus pandemic has put a halt on wildlife tourism, which also provides funding and protection for the conservation efforts, poachers are finding it easier to hunt endangered species. So these animals are not just protected by like rangers and stuff, but they're also protected by tourist presence, just tourists actually being out there. And the poachers typically don't want to be spotted or seen. So if there's tourists out there and people out in public, it kind of deters people from being out there and kind of being sneaky and shooting these animals down. Now, a large portion of the funding for wildlife comes directly from the tourism. So this is just another side effect of the coronavirus. I just kind of wanted to bring some attention to the animals that are facing some hard times, because when you think about the coronavirus lockdown, many people just think it pertains to humans. Well, it also is affecting the animals. It's affecting the food supply. It seems to be a much larger issue at hand. So we'll just see how that plays out. Like I said, I'm really hoping that everything's going to start coming together and starting to get better. With the summer here, I know the weather was really nice today. I got a chance to spend some time with my daughter. We went outside and had a good time. So hopefully you got the opportunity to go out as well. But moving on to our next story, this kind of ties into what we're kind of talking about right now with the endangered animal is mating pandas. So these two Hong Kong zoo pandas, so they're from the zoo in Hong Kong, actually mated for the first time in over a decade, making it an important moment for the species. So love in the time of coronavirus, I guess, is possible. You see it here with the two adorable pandas. Now, the pandas' names are Ying Ying, and Lele. This is kind of cool. It gives them an opportunity to begin reproducing because apparently there's a lot of obstacles and struggles with with the pandas mating. But some people have chalked it up. We were talking about some of the reasons why the lockdown shouldn't necessarily exist. Well, some people saying, well, in the zoo, these pandas didn't really, they struggled mating because all of the people that were coming in, maybe the male panda said, I don't want these people seeing my junk. I don't want them seeing me do my business. So they made it uncomfortable where with all the people spectating them around the clock, essentially, that it made it hard for them to mate. But that's just speculation. No one knows if that's what really actually contributed to them doing that because there's such issues surrounding getting the pandas to actually mate. So I don't know. I thought that was kind of a cool story to bring up. And another thing that's kind of slid under the radar is we've actually been having some really wild and severe weather. Apparently, at least 30 people were killed by tornadoes and severe weather in the southeast USA. So most of it was around Easter. There was a little bit after Easter, there was some really terrible storms and tornadoes, but I didn't hear anything about this. This is typically something you would see in the news a lot about tornadoes or ravaging damage, especially when 30 people have died. But I haven't really heard much about it. But apparently, from what I've read, this is the nation's deadliest tornado outbreak in over 6 years, since April of 2014, when 35 people were killed. So 35 people were killed back in April of 2014, where just 30 people this time. So you would think that would be something that would kind of make the news, but I haven't seen much about it. But it does say here the death toll from the storm so far is staggering. 11 people were killed in Mississippi, 9 were found dead in South Carolina, 6 more dead in Georgia. Others died from falling trees or inside collapsed buildings in Arkansas and North Carolina. So this is something that I believe that's kind of slid up under the radar a little bit. I do have a bunch of I have a link in the description on this story as well if you want to hear more about it. I'm kind of a weather freak. I like storm chasing, as some would call it. So this is what kind of brought my attention to that. Couple guys in the chat, Yang Yang got some yin yang. Oh geez. But anyway, moving on from I was just saying that I really like weather-based stories. There's like that on the Weather Channel. I always watch those severe weather stories where you can watch I shouldn't be alive because of the weather or whatever it is. Those are always kind of interesting to me. But if you're interested in hearing more about that, I do have that linked in the description as well. Moving on to our next story, though, is kind of an interesting one. Apparently, a conspiracy theory that everybody's familiar with, that 5G is causing people or is causing the coronavirus, which is just completely silly to me. But people are actually starting to go out and burn down these 5G towers, primarily in the UK. But apparently it says almost 80 mobile towers have reportedly been burned down in the UK due to false coronavirus conspiracy theories that blame the spread of COVID-19 on 5G. The arson attacks began in early April, with 77 towers now damaged. Business Insider reported on Wednesday, citing Business Insider reported this on Wednesday. Now, they did go on to say daily attacks are very low, but not stopped entirely. But as of April 21st, 40 employees of one of the UK carriers have also been attacked physically or verbally, according to the CEO of the company, which is BT. Now, I'm not familiar with BT. I guess that's the UK's Verizon. But it says we've had one open reach engineer stabbed and put in the hospital. So some of these people are going out, burning these up, and then attacking the workers who are just simply doing their job. But one thing that I want to point out here is some people have speculated that the coronavirus theory about why they're going after the 5G towers is not because they actually believe that the coronavirus is what's causing it. Some people are actually saying there's other reasons behind it. Not that the 5G towers are causing coronavirus, but that it's a form of protest against the technology route that the country has taken. Because a lot of people were at shambles saying that the country should be much further along with 5G, not only 5G, but with free internet. Internet should be something that you could have anywhere in the world with satellites. You could put a satellite up in the sky. Anybody who could connect to that satellite should be able to get free internet where they could sit down and they could watch the K2 podcast for free if they wanted to, if they don't have that internet access. So some people were saying that, this could be a form of protest, and people in the media and the mainstream media is mislabeling it as, they're coronavirus conspiracy theorists. But really, it could be something a little different where it's actually a form of protest. Now, there's no evidence to support that, but I found that to be an interesting take on the matters. And just to address the whole coronavirus portion of it is that over 50 countries have confirmed cases of coronavirus. But from my understanding, there's only a select few countries that have actually these 5G towers. So there's many countries where the coronavirus cases are confirmed, but there are no 5G towers. So how could you say 5G is causing the coronavirus when there's no towers in the countries that have confirmed cases? So that's what leads me to believe that there's something else going on here that we're not necessarily knowing. There could be more to the story. I'll leave that up for you to decide. That's something you'll have to research a little more into for yourself, but I do have the link in the description on this story as well. But moving on to a final story, because this kind of relates to, this isn't our final story, I have one more after this, but this kind of relates to podcasting. Somebody that I tend to check out is Joe Rogan. He has signed a deal which is estimated at over $100 million to go over to Spotify exclusively. Now, Joe Rogan's podcast was on YouTube, just like the K2 podcast is here. It's been on YouTube. You can access it on Spotify, but you can also get it on iTunes. You can also get it on Anchor FM. So you can get my podcast on all those different platforms. Well, Joe Rogan has decided for over $100 million that he's going to move his podcast over to Spotify exclusively. He's not going to be on YouTube anymore. He's not going to be on any other platform, only Spotify. Now, this is an interesting move for podcasters because, one, you see, like right now you're watching the live broadcast of my podcast. Well, Joe Rogan does a similar thing when he has a guest on or he's speaking. He has a video of his broadcast. Well, these same videos are now going to be on Spotify. This could be the beginning of some competition for YouTube. Not only is YouTube losing one of if not the biggest podcast platform or podcaster on their platform, they're losing that, but they're also could be facing some competition from Spotify in the long term. Because if they're going to be adding these videos, what does that mean down the road? Is other podcasters going to join on board with Spotify and be leaving YouTube? Or is Spotify going to come more like a hosting website like YouTube is and offer YouTube some competition? I don't really know. It's kind of interesting to see what's going to happen. I'm going to keep my eye on this situation. A lot of people are saying that YouTube is very unfair in the sense of censorship. There's certain things you can and cannot talk about. Like this video in particular, me talking about the 5G towers being connected to coronavirus could potentially get this show taken down. Now, of course, I'm speaking out against it and saying how I disagree with it, but it's one of those sensitive subjects that they immediately tend to just turn off right away. They just take it down. They don't let you speak about it. You can't even bring up the words a lot of times. And this is some of the issues people have with YouTube. And you're starting to see that this big move from Joe Rogan, who spoke out in the past against YouTube, saying, hey, they're too strict on all of their guidelines. Sometimes they take you down. They don't even tell you why. Some people with conservative viewpoints have been targeted, and their videos have been removed with no explanation. So maybe this will hold YouTube a little bit more accountable. Maybe they'll wise up a little bit. It's hard to say what's actually going to come from this whole move, but I'm interested to see how it's going to go. I really am. So we'll see about that. I don't know what really more there is to say. You can research this story a lot more, or if you're fans of Joe Rogan, I'm sure you've already heard about this news and kind of already know about it. But moving on to our last and final story of the night is next week's guest. We're going to have on a lady by the name of Krista Goodrich. She's also known as the Boss Lady. She's going to be on discussing investments of predominantly for women, because there's women that I've spoken to that always say, hey, Kevin, I want to invest, but I don't know if I can, or they feel insecure, or they're worried about how they can invest. So she's going to be talking about that, but she's also going to be discussing her book, which is titled You Don't Need a Dick to Understand Money. And I want to address a couple things with her, like how does some of this relate to men as well as women? We're going to get into a bunch of different stuff as it comes to investing, money management, ways to conserve your money, especially in a hard time like this. I have Krista's website linked down below as well. I believe it's bossladyinvestor.com. She has another marketing website, which I'm going to get into a little bit more with her. But nonetheless, we're finishing up here a few minutes early for tonight. I definitely appreciate everybody who is tuned in today. I wish I had a little bit more prepared for you guys, but I just kind of wanted to have a little fun today, kind of take it easy, just relax a little bit as we prepare for next week's show with guest Krista Goodrich. So I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully you found some of these stories interesting and some of the takes that we discussed. Maybe they were a little bit thought-provoking, maybe they weren't. But nonetheless, I certainly appreciate everybody for tuning into the show. It really means a lot. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel here. I would certainly appreciate that. It helps me grow. Please hit that thumbs up button. That would mean the world to me. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Today is Monday, May 25th. We're going to see you next Monday at 7 p.m. with guest Krista Goodrich. I think we're going to really have a great show for you next week. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thank you, and have a good night.